So today I'm going to tell you about a work that we recently published, and that was led largely by my PhD student, Lavender Zhang, who is co-advised by Eric Warman, who's a neurosurgeon at NYU Langone Hospital System. And it's going to be, of course, about language model. Now, first, I think I can actually skip the first two slides because I was thinking about, I wanted to tell you, what are you reminded of when you hear the word AI? And nowadays, it's pretty obvious, in particular today, because it's all language models. And a bit of image generation, we learned about the multimodal model. And I really don't have to tell you how amazing it is. I just asked the ChatGPT the question, and it was just give me the answer that was so much better than any answer that I could have come up with immediately. So in that sense, I would say, well, okay, this is awesome. So let's not try to waste any time convincing you how awesome these things are. And then I'm going to move on to the next one. All right, AI for healthcare. What are you reminded of? Unless you are actually working in healthcare, first thing that comes to your mind is that, I want to use AI in order to detect a disease early on. So for instance, we've been actually working at NYU Langone on building an AI system that's going to read the breast mammogram, so screening mammography, X-ray, and then trying to detect whether there is a malignant lesion or not. And the second thing that often comes to your mind is that, we got to come up with a better treatment plan. So can I use AI to do that? And then one of the examples that I'm showing you there is that based on, let's say, biopsy, can I actually tell what kind of cancer treatment is going to be most effective so that I can actually provide the cancer patient with the best care? And then the third one you can imagine is the drug discovery. Can we use AI to discover a new drug that we never actually saw before and that nature has never even imagined creating before? And in fact, I can tell you a lot about the drug discovery. I could have actually talked about it instead of the healthcare, but because I serve as a senior director of the frontier research at Genentech as part of the team called Prescient Design, which I co-founded earlier on. And then there, we are using machine learning. In fact, multiple machine learning paradigms all together with a wet lab in order to find the new antibodies for any given target. So these are the things that that comes to your mind when you think about the AI for healthcare. Again, unless you work at healthcare yourself. And then the question I want to ask is that, then is AI for healthcare equivalent to curing a disease with AI? It almost feels like that's what we should do, and then that's what we should actually aim to do so. But it turned out that that's not necessarily so, because when it comes to healthcare or the health, curing disease or detecting disease is just one aspect. And we already saw it ourselves in 2020. At the beginning of 2020, in particular in the US, and I was in New York back then, and it was pretty bad, we saw that we actually learned that there aren't just enough ICU beds for the society. So if everyone is getting sick simultaneously, we just won't be able to accommodate them, even if they are sick with the condition that we know how to treat or handle. And then we realized that we were actually running out of masks, surgical masks. And who knew that was going to happen? And then we were running out of ventilators. Again, the same thing. Somehow, it turned out that this pandemic told us that the healthcare is not really only about curing disease, but trying to provide the services to as many people as possible, given a limited resources. In other words, healthcare has a resource allocation issues. We cannot really have as many ICU beds as there are people in the society. It's just kind of impossible to start with. And then sometimes we have to be much more adaptive. Things that we don't anticipate happens. There was a COVID-19 pandemic that we just went through. So then the question is, how are we going to allocate all those resources in order to maximize the equity in healthcare throughout the entire society? And yet, in order to tackle this issue of resource allocation, what we really need to do is know or identify what kind of decisions are made within a hospital system, and then try to facilitate such decisions so that we can avoid any unnecessary waste within the hospital system. That is, every time we make an incorrect or suboptimal decision, we are misallocating resources leading to overall worse healthcare to everyone and to the overall society. So let's look at what kind of decisions are made in the hospital. So patient or non-patient comes to the hospital, and there are so many things that the patients can go through. We need to make a decision about whether the patient needs to be, let's say, go through the blood work. If so, what kind of blood work? maybe patient needs to go through some kind of imaging. But what kind of imaging? X-ray, MRI, ultrasound, whatnot. And then perhaps patient needs to be prescribed some kind of drug. There are tons of drugs from which the patient should be prescribed. And then maybe patient needs to go through the procedure. Well, what kind of procedure? By which doctors? And then all these things are going to be recorded in the electronic health records. And then based on what has been done to the patient or the measures from the patient, the clinician is going to meet with the patient, trying to consult them. And then based on that, doctor is going to write a clinical note summarizing what has been done to the patient and then everything that doctor knows about the patient, based off of which the whole hospital system is going to make various clinical as well as the operational decisions. Will we admit the patient? Will we discharge the patient? Are we going to prescribe a further, let's say, follow-up drugs for them? Or are we going to just schedule a follow-up care course? And on and on. There are so many decisions that need to be made and that are made every single second in any reasonably sized hospital system in the world. Now, how can we actually help making this kind of decision better? It turned out that prediction is what we really need in order to facilitate decision making. I'll just take as an example of one example. So whenever you're admitted to a hospital, and by the time you're discharged, the hospital needs to decide how many follow-up calls they're going to make. Often they're going to make the first follow-up call 24 hours after you're discharged. And then, standard care tends to be 2 follow-up calls in total. So about 3 or 4 days later, you're going to get another follow-up call. And we all know that the follow-up calls actually do save a lot of resources as well as save patients' lives as well, because when the patients actually are readmitted, then that often means that something bad really happened. And then some of the things can be really mitigated by having a simple phone call by a nurse. And then if we can predict that the discharged patient is likely to be readmitted, then we can imagine that we can increase the number of the follow-up calls in order to ensure that we know exactly what's going to happen in advance so that we can address them early on. And otherwise, we're going to keep it low in order to avoid any kind of wasted calls and time. And then, again, in healthcare, resources are always limited. The number of the hours that nurses and clinicians need to spend is extremely limited compared to the number of the patients that we need to handle. But then if you start from here, there are so many things that we want to predict. So we want to know whether the patient is going to be readmitted at the time of the discharge. We probably need to know whether the patient is going to die during their admission or at the hospital. Because if we can predict that, then we're going to increase, the care for the patient. We probably want to know how long this patient is going to stay at the hospital. That allows us to do a better resource allocation or the optimization of the hospital beds, and then you have the various cares. And we probably want to know what kind of underlying health issues the patient has. If the patient is predicted to have, bad, health condition or the underlying health, then we probably want to take extra care for them. And then one of the things that actually matters, but that is really, really not visible and also controversial from the outsider perspective, is that we often want to predict whether the insurance company is going to deny the claim as well. Because at the end of the day, what happens is hospital is going to treat a patient and is going to bill the insurance company. But the insurance companies are going to always go through the rules, and then as long as, unless there is perfect, they're going to always send it back. And it's going back and forth between the hospital and the insurance company is actually wasting a lot of time and increases the frustration, not only on the hospital, but also on the patients as well. But if we can actually predict in advance, we can prepare the insurance claim better in order to avoid this kind of unnecessary back and forth between the hospital and the insurance companies. And then there are so many more, of course, on top of that. Unfortunately, building a predictor to answer those questions is extremely laborious. So fortunately, we have an electronic health record in nowadays, in most of the, reasonable, healthcare systems. But then, having the data set does not necessarily mean that we're going to get a predictor automatically. We need to look at the data set to figure out what are the relevant features and then what are the features that are available. And given that, we're going to collect the data. And then once the data is collected, we're going to use a machine learning algorithm in order to build a predictor. Now, as you probably have already experienced yourself, you cannot build a predictor at once that is perfect. We always iterate nonstop. So what we're going to do is we're going to, in fact, go back to the very first step, that is to figure out the relevant features, and then go through this cycle again and again until we feel that we have a reasonable predictor. But the unfortunate thing is we have to do it for every single prediction question that I showed you in the previous slide. And then those are only 5 of them, 5 or if not hundreds, if not thousands of those predictors. It's just so difficult to do so. And then this is where we or at least me as a natural language processing researcher, started to realize that wait, hold on. What if we don't have to choose these relevant features, or we don't have to pre-process these relevant features ourselves? And then that's where the clinical notes comes in. So in 2019, together with my collaborators at NYU Langone, we started to notice that, well, these language models are getting really, really good. So can we actually build a language model that's not going to read the natural language text, but the clinical language text? So before I told you about whether we actually built it or not, let me tell you about the clinical notes. If you recall from the previous slide where I told you about what kind of things happen, what kind of decisions need to be happen whenever there is a patient at the hospital, what you notice is that whatever happens to the patient is going to record it on the electronic health records, and also is going to be summarized by the clinician in a clinical note. And then that happens every time any patient comes to the hospital and goes through anything that is measured, anything that is imaged, anything that is essentially any kind of surgery they go through and whatnot. So I'll show you one example of a clinical note here, and then what it actually contains. In clinical note, the first thing you see is that it actually tells you about everything we need to know about the patient themselves. You get the age of the patient, you get what kind of history they have that are relevant to the current, let's say, case. And then you're going to see what kind of things have been done to the patients. And then based on that, you're going to see quite long, let's say, description of the findings the doctor saw on whatever the procedure or the imaging that have been done. And it's quite extensive because they are trained to write everything they see and then use in order to arrive at any kind of conclusion. And then at the very end, they're going to write the impression, which is not only about what has been done to the patient, but also their subjective evaluation or assessment of the situation based on their experience and expertise. At the very end, they even send you a note to the patient so that the patient can feel better as well. And then don't worry about the privacy here. This is my own note, so at the end, I give you the consent to look at it as much as you want. So then you see where we are headed, right? Okay, so everyone is excited by these language models. And then, in fact, many of the researchers, myself, and then a lot of people who already gave a talk today have been excited by these language models ever since, 2010 or 2009. And then we noticed that the clinical notes are actually all there. It's a gigantic treasure trove of the clinical notes. So now, can we actually combine these two in order to facilitate all these prediction or the predictive tasks within the hospital so that we can provide or that we can make the healthcare more equitable? So what we decided to go for was what we call a unified approach to all the so-called last mile problems. So we start from the clinical notes, and then we build a language model that is able to read these clinical notes that are written in clinical language. And then based on what it has read from the clinical notes, it's going to help us make predictions on all those different last mile problems. Thereby, it helps us actually make better decisions, which will help us optimize the resource allocations in healthcare or the health system. And then we call this language model that we have trained a Neutron. And we trained this model on the 10 years of the clinical notes collected from the NYU Langone hospital system. That is from 2011 to 2020. It includes more than 300,000 patients and then more than 7 million notes that corresponds to about 4 to 5 billion tokens. And then the nice thing about being in New York City is that we really get all this data from a diverse population. I'm just showing you one aspect of the demographic diversity in New York City. And then you see that the racial diversity is extremely even there. So the model that I'm telling you here is actually not that large to the modern standard, but in 2019 it was actually pretty large. It's based on BERT, and then we trained it from scratch. It has 100 million parameters, and then it took us about 3 weeks on the 24800 GPUs to train one model, the final model we have. Now, if we do it now, then it's going to take, my guess is that 3 days on probably just 800 GPUs. And then once the BERT is pre-trained from scratch, we're going to fine-tune with a classifier head, edit for each and every task separately. It's just a very standard, let's say, approach. We're not innovating on the method here, but we're trying to demonstrate that this is a really powerful way for us to solve all possible prediction problems within the hospital system with a single methodology. So we tested on actually these 5 problems that I told you earlier about: readmission prediction, in-hospital mortality prediction, comorbidity imputation, length of stay prediction, and insurance denial prediction. And then we actually did build ourselves the individual baselines for the individual problem, which was actually much more painful than training this one language model and then fine-tuning all the data that we get access to. And then what you see is that indeed, it actually works better than all the baselines that we had to spend tons of time to build. What this means is, and then the scalability is here. If we want to solve another prediction task, all we need to do is just collect more labels and then fine-tune this language model that we have trained already. And because we trained everything from ourselves, and then we have access to all the data within the NYU Langone hospital system, we could actually test a lot. We could be a bit more rigorous and scientific about using these language models. So one thing that we tested was that whether it matters that we build a clinical language model, or can we actually use just a generic language model that was trained on the in-trend or the web text only? It turned out that it's really important to train or pre-train this language model on a clinical language. It's unsurprising in hindsight in the sense that the clinical languages are not natural languages. It has a lot of idiosyncrasies of themselves. And furthermore, we actually noticed that there is a big, let's say, dependence on the regional differences as well, the regionality as well. So the model that we trained on our data tended to work better on our own fine-tuning tasks than another language model that was trained on a clinical notes from another state, which again, in hindsight, obvious, but often nowadays what we hear is that, well, here's a gigantic large-scale language model. It's going to solve everything because it's so general purpose. But in reality, when you're trying to solve a real-world problem, the dependence on the data is true, is real. And furthermore, we even noticed that even the individual clinics matter. NYU Langone Hospital System has a multiple inpatient clinics and about 300 outpatient clinics. And then they are spread throughout the 5 boroughs of the New York City. And there are 2 major sites. One is in Manhattan, and the other is in Brooklyn. So we could actually collect the data from 2 sites separately, and then tested our language model after fine-tuning on this kind of site-specific data on the cross-site, let's say, test sets. And then what we see is that it actually does matter that we actually reuse the label data from the right clinic that we're going to deploy. And then this really helped, well, the diversity within New York City really helped. So this also has another side to it, is that, yes, it's really important to think about the real-world problems, and then when you test it, you have to really ensure that you are testing to reflect the diversity of the real world. And of course, we're very, very encouraged by all these findings, so what did we do? We actually deployed it in the hospital, such that for the readmission prediction, when the clinician decides to discharge a patient, the clinician is going to write a discharge note that's going to, oops, all those the arrows are mixed up, but okay. The clinician is going to write a discharge note that's going to be automatically sent to the EHR, and EHR is going to trigger sending it to the Neutron. So it's going to do the automated inference, and then sends the prediction back to the clinician by email. Now for this one, we didn't want to do the interventional study. We are designing that one, so we just received the emails ourselves. We kind of, let's say, intercepted it in the middle. But this really allows us to test whether this predictor is making a prediction in the real world and accurately. Because at the end of the day, if you just make sure that we have a training, validation, and test set, and then follow what we are told in the Machine Learning 101, it should be all fine. We don't really need to do it. But are we really doing that? We always look at the tested accuracy over and over, so we're overfitting it. But this way, even if it's non-interventional, in this kind of prospective, let's say, evaluation, we cannot cheat. And then we get the precisely true generalization accuracy. And then indeed, the generalization accuracy was lower than the accuracy that we would get in the offline evaluation. And then we deployed it for about 4 months within the hospital. And then there were quite a lot of cases of the discharge, about 30,000 of them. And then we randomly chose 100 correctly predicted readmissions from our Neutron model. And then we gathered the 6 physicians of the different seniorities within the Langone system to go through each and every one of them carefully in order to review what kind of things were predicted correctly to be readmitted. And among these 100 randomly sampled correctly predicted readmissions, 61% were unplanned, and about 50% were considered penalizable from the insurance company. And then 27% were preventable, only if the clinician could get the second opinion on the fly. And then 20% of them, unfortunately, experienced the adverse effect or, in fact, died after the readmission. And then this really tells us that, okay, there is a signal these predictive models are giving us that we can use in order to make a better decision and also adapt our, let's say, care in order to ensure that the patients are not going to be readmitted more, and then patients are going to be, let's say, treated better. Now, this is just a very, very small first step we have barely taken, and then many more steps are remaining here. And then I'll just touch upon the two things. First one is that this study wasn't interventional in a sense that it really tells us about the predictive power of this language model for the clinical, let's say, decision making, but it doesn't really tell us about the clinical impact. So what we need to do is to really spend a lot of time and then invest a lot of money and effort in order to design prospective and interventional studies to establish the actual clinical impact. You can imagine that in the case of the readmission prediction, we can think of the, let's say, intervention as changing the number of the follow-up calls, and then effect or the outcome that we are going to measure is whether the readmission rate drops down or not. And then second thing is the multimodal clinical language model. So what I showed you is purely on text, so the clinical notes only. And then clinical notes are amazingly enriched feature set of any patient because they were created by the extremely well-trained, let's say, clinicians in these healthcare systems. Unfortunately, clinical notes, because of that, can only reflect the things that humans can see. But what we have seen during the past, let's say, decade or so in the medical imaging and other field is that this machine learning system, when trained on a proper labels, can see beyond what humans can see. In fact, one of our models for the breast cancer screening, we were able to observe multiple times that this deep neural network was able to properly predict a malignant lesion that was deemed mammographically occult. That is, on X-ray to human eyes, they are not visible. So what we want is that if we want our clinical language model to be able to see beyond what the clinicians were able to see before. And to wrap up, this kind of language models or the advances of the AI, we hear about all those amazing things about it, right? We hear about, when we play around with the ChatGPT, we're so surprised how amazing these things are. But at the same time, I think that there are a lot of distractions coming out of this kind of fancy applications coming out. Often they're all focused on the conversational aspect of these models. And in reality, there are so many real-world problems that we did not even think of solving before because we didn't have tools like the language models. And then now is the time for us to actually get out of those conventional benchmarks and then try to solve the real-world problems. And then hopefully this is one example that actually gives you a sense that, okay, what kind of problems there are out there that we can actually solve with this kind of advanced, let's say, AI algorithms. And then that concludes my talk. Thank you.
Thank you for a great talk. So in the interest of time, we will open, we can take the questions, but only 2 questions.
Thank you. So the question that I have is, how do you incorporate the length of the clinical notes? Like they could have a longer context size, which is longer than the context window that the large language models can actually ingest. How do you get around that problem?
Yeah, so in our case, we just follow the BERT almost to the letter. So it could take in 512 tokens. Now, about 70% or so of the clinical notes that we had were under, let's say, 512 tokens, but of course, there were a few that were outliers. Now, in that case, during the training, we take random chunks, and then during the testing, we take either the first one, or we do the ensemble of the first one and the last one. it turned out, we haven't really written it down on the paper. It turned out that most of the important things are either at the beginning or at the end of the clinical notes, and then that's because of the patient history and then impression are at the beginning and the end. So that was enough, but we believe also that if we train a larger model that can take into account the much larger context, it's going to get better. In fact, that's exactly what Lavender, the PhD student, and Eric are trying to do as we speak.
But there's also this recent paper that shows that mostly, even if you can expand the context window size to a large number, let's say 100,000 tokens with Claude, for instance,
Yes.
but still the models focuses more on the beginning and the end of the text.
Absolutely. So I think that we are at a point where we have to be a bit careful about distinguishing what models can do or what algorithms can do, and then what data actually tells us. Now, if we assume that this algorithm was really perfect, so it is an algorithm that is able to capture all those long-range dependencies, and then we train it on some particular data set, and then test it on some particular benchmark, and then you show that, well, these models are only looking at a nearby, let's say, context, that actually tells us about not the algorithm, but about the data and the problem. So if we have a good algorithm, which I believe we do, I mean, it's not perfect, but getting better every day, then it's more about whether this task actually requires these models to look at these long-range dependencies. And then unfortunately, that's largely empirical. So we'll see whether this kind of, let's say, clinical prediction tasks require long-range dependencies.
Thank you.
So we have one more question here.
Thank you. It seems you have a formidable generalization issue, because looking at the difference between Manhattan and Brooklyn, what does this tell us about the standards of clinical practice? And what about thoughts about generalization of the model?
Yeah, unfortunately, because of the time limitation, I couldn't put actually all those analyses that we did. What you see is that indeed, however you slice the data, you're always going to see that on some portion of the data, our model's accuracy is higher, and then some other portion of the data, the accuracy is going to be lower. Now, I can give you an example. In the case of the 30-day unplanned, the all-cause readmission prediction, if we look at the accuracies across the races, unsurprisingly, in America, the accuracy for the Black patients is lower than all the other races, but then, weirdly, the accuracy for the Chinese patients are higher than all the other races. Now, what does it tell us? We actually don't know exactly why. So in the case of the Black patients, we can say that, okay, due to the systematic, let's say, issues, the Black patients tend to not reveal about themselves to clinicians, and then that's probably the reason why the clinical notes don't have enough information for the model to make proper, let's say, I don't know, like prediction. But in the case of the Chinese patients, why? We don't really know. And then we can find that like so much. We can find that for the monthly. So if we divide the data along the month, we do see that the accuracy is much higher during the spring and fall, much lower during summer and winter. Winter we can understand, summer why? We actually don't know. So now what this actually tells us is that yes, all those interpretability, explainability, and the understanding what these models are doing is really important as well. However, there will always be limitation, because the limitation comes from the fact that we can only analyze the things that we know. We cannot really analyze things that we don't even know how to analyze. That's the reason I believe that the first thing we need to do in this clinical language model or the clinical prediction field is to spend much more time and then move our focus away from the prediction and then working on the benchmark to the prospective and interventional studies.
Thank you.